Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 7 of season 5 of Star Trek Discovery, called Erigah. And this show seems to be getting worse and worse, even visually. At least in previous seasons, as stupid as things got, there was always a lot of visual candy. It was obviously full of very expensive special effects, and so there was always something to look at. And yet in this season, even that is lacking. And almost every episode feels like a bottle show with very little special effects, and even some characters disappear with no reason, like where is Saru? He's missing for a few episodes, and even Mrs. T and Lisa Lazy Eye disappeared for no reason without any explanation and got replaced by two different female pilots whose names I don't really remember, even though at least they had that scene giving them 20 seconds to talk about themselves, but that was it for their character development. And one of them is that Bajoran woman who doesn't know what a wormhole should look like. So even cast members are disappearing from the show and being replaced by others without any explanation, so I'm guessing there were some attempts to save money maybe or something, so there's a very little special effects, and that would be okay if the story and dialogue would actually be good. Then, some of the best episodes of Star Trek were just people sitting in rooms and talking, but if the dialogue was good, that was okay. And yet here, everything is bad. So even the dialogue, the story. So first of all, there's not even one mention of the Prime Directive violation that occurred in the previous episode. Remember how Raynor said, we cannot violate the Prime Directive, there will be consequences, and Michael does it anyway, and there is literally not a single line of dialogue indicating any kind of consequences whatsoever. And she is meeting with the Admiral and with politicians in this episode, and absolutely no one cares, no one even mentions what happened in the previous episode. So anyway, we find out that Shin Hoti and Skrull were captured off-screen by some other ship, and then Discovery jumps to pick them up, and then they say because Shin Hoti was behaving aggressively anytime they try to separate her from Skrull, they just decide to put them together. So they're constantly together in the same force field, because otherwise they will get annoyed, otherwise they will be pissed off, and that's bad, so we'll just keep them together. And of course later on, that created all the mess. All the problems of this episode were created because of this decision. So the incompetence of Starfleet and the Federation in this show is absolutely ridiculous. It would have been better off to just not capture them, because by capturing them, it invited the Brin into a confrontation with the Federation. So it would have been better off to just leave them in space and avoid all of these problems of this episode. And even if the Brin learned about the progenitor tech, they still didn't have any of the clues. And so what if they learn about it? So it's not a big deal to just let them have these criminals. So instead, Starfleet brings them in and then has to protect them from the Brin Empire, which somehow is much more powerful than the Federation without any explanation. How come in previous seasons it was apparently the Orions who were controlling the galaxy and the Brin were not even mentioned, and yet suddenly the Brin are the most powerful empire in the galaxy? They have ships bigger than Borg cubes, and the Federation is terrified of even one of their ships. And so maybe it wasn't a good idea to give the Elysium to the whole galaxy. Maybe you should have kept it for yourself and only give the Elysium to your friends and allies, and not just give it to everyone, including your enemies, because how else can the Brin suddenly rise to dominance over the whole galaxy unless they got some dilithium? And in one scene they actually offer to pay them dilithium, and then the Brin refuse. So obviously they are not desperate for it, they don't actually need it. And so if they're so powerful, how come they were never mentioned in the previous seasons? How come the Orions seem to be controlling the galaxy? And so it doesn't make any sense. So anyway, Skrull is apparently dying in sickbay, and then Dr. Colbert says that Brin will heal better if they're cold, and so they need to find some captured Brin technology. He says he found some in the archives of the Federation headquarters, and they need to get that captured Brin technology to make it colder for him so that he can heal better, because the Brin are now like universal soldiers that if you cool them down then they heal better. And so I kept thinking, why do you need captured Brin technology to simply make it colder? Can't you simply do it by yourself with your own technology? Can't you simply make it colder in sickbay for him? And instead they have to go to Federation headquarters to get the technology. And then the Admiral tells Michael that the Brin must have intercepted their signal, and they know that they have Shin Hoti and Skrull, and so the Brin are coming to them, demanding they hand them over. And he tells Michael he will give them that Brin piece of technology that can make Skrull cooler, and then they need to jump far enough away so the Brin don't capture them. And then Michael once again bosses around the Admiral and convinces him to do otherwise, even though it makes no sense. The Admiral offered the logical solution of using the spore drive to jump far enough away that the Brin cannot get them. And then the Brin won't have the incentive to go to war with the Federation, since Discovery is very far away, they will not be able to get them anyway, so it will convince the Brin not to start a war. But Michael says, no, we should confront them now, we cannot use the spore drive, because they'll find us anyway. They can track our spore signature. How can they track it? It was never previously mentioned that anyone can track it. But suddenly they say the Brin can't, and so what? Let's say they can. Can they get anywhere in the galaxy? Wouldn't it take years to get to the other side of the galaxy? I mean, they said in the previous season when they were going to the border of the galaxy, they said specifically that without the spore drive, it will take decades to get there with normal warp engines, and so even though we are far in the future, it doesn't mean they can use normal warp drive to get all over the galaxy. They said that in the previous season specifically, that without the spore drive, it will take them decades to get to the edge of the galaxy. So why not simply take Skrull and Shin-Hoti to some faraway colony, maybe the one they mentioned in the Gamma Quadrant, and just leave them there and then jump somewhere else, and then the Brin will never know where they are. You can jump to multiple places to give them multiple targets. Jump all over the galaxy so the Brin will not know where to go, and leave them in just one of those places. In the Brin, it will take them decades to get there. And that way you can hide them. You know, Shin-Hoti and Skrull can then take a shuttle from that location to some other location nearby. So the Brin will have absolutely no way to find them. But no, Michael says, no, we cannot hide. They will find us anyway. And that really reminds me of that problem, that logical problem I had back in Season 2, when they couldn't use the spore drive to get away from Control. You know, that AI that was chasing them around, and they said they will find us wherever we go. That's why they had to jump to the future to get away. Why couldn't they simply use the spore drive to jump somewhere far in the galaxy and hide somewhere, hide the ship in some distant part of the galaxy? And so the same thing here. They just cannot use the spore drive, even though obviously it would be very useful. You know, that's one of the problems of this show in general, that they made the ship overpowered, which begs the question, why don't they use this power? And so they just don't. They assume it will be useless. Why? There is no logical explanation. And so the Admiral is convinced by Michael the Discovery should stay and they should simply face the Brin no matter what. And so first of all, it makes no sense. And secondly, as always, Michael is bossing everyone around. Michael is smarter than everyone else, even though if we analyze it logically, then it's the other way around. It's all stupid, but for some reason everyone listens to her as if she's some sort of genius. And then there's a scene when Jim Raynor is being very xenophobic toward the Brin. He reminds everyone how the Brin once attacked the Federation, and how there's a Romulan saying, never turn your back on the Brin. So at least it feels as if someone has been reading Memory Alpha, telling us about the Brin, and then he's been shut down by everyone who tells him he's being xenophobic and being unreasonable and too aggressive because he's spelling them simple facts, and then they kick him out of the room. Then Michael tells him, wait for me outside, as if she's his teacher and he's some undisciplined kid in school. And then he waits for her outside in the corridor, where she comes out and starts lecturing him about how to behave more properly. So all of it is absolutely ridiculous. The way that in this whole season she has to educate the aggressive white man about how to be more politically correct and not to trash talk the Brin. Even though they later reveal in this episode that the reason he's been so angry toward the Brin is because of his own tragic backstory, which, you know how in every episode someone always has to tell about some tragic backstory. So apparently when he was a kid, the Brin conquered his home planet and committed genocide, and he's the only survivor of his whole family. So that's why he's so angry toward the Brin. And somehow his story is later useful because of his personal knowledge about some other Brin leader who was a female. They somehow use that story to bluff their way against the other Brin leader who is in this episode, and so at least it was useful. How convenient is it that whenever they face some kind of villain, someone in the crew happens to know that villain? So anyway, Michael goes to interrogate Shin-Hoti and Skrull, whom they keep together in the same force field, and the force field is once again made from hexagons, and it's funny how even the Brin ship has like a huge open cargo bay, which also has a force field made of hexagons. And so how come all the alien species in the galaxy all use exactly the same force field technology, always made from hexagons on the show. So anyway, Michael tries to interrogate Shin Hoti and Scroll, and they are not answering any of her questions, and yet she keeps asking them, and somehow just by looking at them, she knows all the answers. They actually don't give her any information, but she guesses all of it by herself, magically. Like, she knows all of their history and all the backstory and all of Scroll's family background just by asking questions and looking at their facial responses, and she knows all the answers somehow. Wouldn't it be more clever if it was Book in this scene? You know, at least Book has some telepathic powers, and so it would make sense that he can gain information in this kind of interrogation. But no, it's Michael. She just asks questions, they don't respond, and then she immediately automatically knows all the answers without them saying anything at all. So that was absolutely ridiculous. So she finds out that Scroll is royalty, and that's why his uncle needs him to become the Brin Emperor, because there are several Brin leaders competing to be the Emperor, and for some reason his uncle needs him because he's a direct line of descent of the previous Emperor, and that's the real reason they want them so badly, not because of the Erigah, the blood bounty on them. And meanwhile, Tilly and Stamens are trying to figure out the next clue, which is on some piece of metal, and it has some Beta Z writings on it, and Stamens asks Tilly to work with Adira to figure out the text itself while he works on the materials of that plate to try to figure out where it came from. And later Book comes to Stamens to help him, and then Stamens says that they're doing divide and conquer on this clue. They divided their effort, that he's working on the materials while Adira and Tilly are working on the text. And once again, they are using this phrase incorrectly. Remember back in season 2 of Picard, they did that when Seven of Nine and Raffi were running out into a field full of assimilated Borg soldiers with weapons, and they only had a knife and an ice pick. And Seven says, we'll divide and conquer. So they run in separate directions to be able to take on those dozens of Borg assimilated super soldiers and somehow easily beat them, because they used divide and conquer methods, which the writers think it means you have to divide your forces to attack the enemy, which is not the original meaning of this phrase. This phrase means you have to divide your enemy into groups which are fighting each other so that you can conquer them, but the writers of these Star Trek shows don't seem to know that. And then we have the scene of Tilly and Adira working together, and Adira once again has some kind of internal turmoil, something is bothering her, and then Tilly has to cheer her up, Tilly has to be her emotional support group, and they have all this cringy kind of dialogue, and then Adira says, thanks Teach, because Tilly is a teacher, and you know how in all the new Star Trek shows they also love to shorten words for some reason. They always shorten everything into shorter words for some reason. Except when it comes to pronouns, then you have to make things longer and more complicated and more confusing. But all the other examples, you have to make everything shorter. So anyway, they find out this clue was written by a Betazoid woman whose name was Marina, which I guess is a reference to Marina Sirtis, who played Diana Troy. So they're talking about some Betazoid scientist whose name was Marina. And to be able to figure out the clue, they have to find someone who's an expert on ancient texts and books, and they ask the computer who on the ship might be an expert on that, and the computer tells them that Jet Reno is an expert in ancient texts and stuff like that. And then they come to visit Reno to get her expertise. But remember that Reno came with them on the ship from the past, from the 23rd century, and they said that this clue was created in the 24th century. And then they come to her and asked, oh, you used to be a collector of sorts, you used to be a smuggler, you used to deal in ancient texts, so maybe you can help us out. But how would she be able to if when the time she came from, it didn't yet exist? It was created a century later. So how the hell would she know anything about it from her time as that expert of ancient artifacts? And so nothing makes any kind of sense at all, as usual. Why would they expect her to know anything about it? Somehow it did turn out to be useful, because she told them that there's some kind of ship which is hiding in space, which is collecting information, collecting ancient texts, and so they have to find that ship next. That will be in the next episode, I guess. It reminds me of that whole thing with the seed ship from season 3 when they had to find some specific plant, and so they had to find a seed ship which is collecting all the seeds from the whole galaxy and is hiding somewhere in the galaxy. And so now the same thing is with this other ship which is also hiding somewhere in the galaxy, which is collecting all the ancient texts for some reason and hiding out in space and changing locations. So it's the exact same idea again. And meanwhile Stamens hits a dead end, but when Book helps him out, it turns out there's some kind of telepathic signature on that plate, and so because Book is an empath, he might be able to read it, and so he activates his glowing forehead and is able to see some vision that was implanted on that little metal plate. And at least it's not contradicting anything, because I do remember there was an episode of TNG when Diana had some kind of vision because some Beta Z implanted some telepathic memory on a wall or something, so when she touched that wall it gave her a vision, and so at least it fits with that, so it's not contradicting anything. And he had a vision of some kind of huge plasma storm in space, and later in the episode they find out that's the Badlands from Deep Space Nine, you know, that area of space which had plasma storms. So I guess that's the only area in the galaxy that is like that. No other place is like that. So that's how they were able to find it, simply because Book had a vision telling them about these plasma fires in space, and that's how they knew to go to the Badlands in the next episode. And meanwhile the Admiral and the Vulcan president are negotiating with the Brin, and the Brin keep using phrases that don't make any sense. You know how the Erigah is a blood bounty, and they even said, the Brin leader specifically says that you can only fulfill it with blood, they cannot pay them off, and that blood will be spilled, and so he's constantly using those kinds of phrases. But remember, in Deep Space Nine they said the Brin don't have blood. So why are they using phrases like blood all the time? And there's also a piece of dialogue when he called the Federation spineless. So isn't that kind of funny coming from someone who wants to be gelatinous? You know, we saw them in their gelatinous form, and they seem to be transparent. Apparently they don't have any bones, and so how come they're calling other people spineless when that is what they literally are in their gelatinous state? So calling other people spineless is an insult. Coming from them, it sounds kind of fishy. And their ship is absolutely gigantic. It looks much bigger than a Borg cube, and the Federation is absolutely terrified from them, and that's only one Brin ship. And I keep thinking, why didn't you hide your headquarters in that cloaked bubble that they had in season 3? Remember when the Federation were always hiding in that cloaked bubble that no one will be able to find them, and that's how they're able to survive. And so why don't they just activate that same bubble now before the Brin arrive? I mean, this headquarters station is able to fly. We saw that in previous seasons, that it is able to fly at warp. It even flew all the way to Earth. And so why don't they just fly away now to some secure location, or just hide somewhere and activate their cloaked bubble? But no one even seems to remember that they had that kind of technology, and so they just wait for the Brin to arrive, and then are absolutely terrified from the Brin, who appear as a giant hologram to communicate with them. Why do they allow that hologram to be so huge? Why don't they make it smaller? It's a hologram, right? So why does it appear so huge in the middle of their station? I mean, they do allow the transmission to pass, right? So why can't they simply, shrink it with a move of your hand, make him really tiny? So why is he appearing like a giant head to be scarier? So that's also kind of laughable. And then they offer the Brin like 50 metric tons of dilithium, so they will leave them alone, and then they won't. So how come the Brin have their own dilithium? Is it because they were spreading around dilithium for free to everyone in the previous season? And I said back then, isn't that kind of a risky idea? Why are you giving everyone dilithium when you control the only supply? Isn't that an opportunity to make alliances, to make friends? Everyone will want to sign treaties with you, and then you give them dilithium. But now they gave it to everyone, and now the Brin don't even want anymore, and they're more powerful than them now. So that is, again, making the Federation look stupid. And then they use the knowledge they gained from Gene Raynor's sad backstory of his childhood when his family was killed by the Brin. It was done by a female Brin leader called Tahal. And so in the scene in which they're meeting this Brin leader, the uncle of Skrull, they tell him they already made a deal with Tahal, and that scares off this Brin leader, and that's why he's allowing them to keep the prisoners, to just keep the status quo and just leave. But then Shin Hoti tries to escape. Remember how I said it was stupid to keep them locked up together? And even though these two are so dangerous, half the season was spent chasing them, but they only put a few incompetent guards in the room with them and just one force field. And so once again making Starfleet look stupid. And we also had a cameo by the Yum Yum lady, who was the security officer on Discovery back in season 2. So she's here as well, but it served no purpose for the story whatsoever. Why is she here exactly? When it could have been anyone else, and so it was just a pointless cameo. And so Skrull creates a distraction by hacking the biobed to inject himself too much of the sedative. And then the doctor lowers the force field, and then Shin Hoti beats up everyone in the room, all the guards, and even the doctor who was trying to help them and trying to save her boyfriend's life. And yet she beats him up and shoots him. And across this whole episode, she's been very bitchy and very annoying. And I know she's a villain, but even villains are more fun when you kind of like them a little bit. A villain should have some charisma so that you enjoy their presence on the screen, and yet she is the opposite. She is probably one of the worst villains I ever saw, not just in Star Trek, but in all of media, because she's literally annoying in every single line of dialogue she has. She's constantly bitching to everyone about everything. Even as they're trying to save the life of her boyfriend, she's cursing them out and interfering with them. So that is absolutely stupid. And here he injects himself with too much drugs so that they will try to save his life so that she can escape on a shuttle. And he tells them, you can beam me up to the shuttle later. They just seem to think they'll be able to escape on a small shuttle from the headquarters of the Federation, which have a bunch of ships around it, and the biggest Brin ship ever, which is bigger than a Borg cube right next to it. But no, they'll be able to escape on a small shuttle. That's what they seem to think is possible in this situation. And apparently it's almost successful, like she's literally almost able to steal a shuttle, but then they tell her Skrull is dying because he took too much of that sedative, and Book comes to talk with her and convinces her to come and say goodbye to him. And so she believes him, and then she comes back, and Skrull is indeed dying, and apparently dies. And I kept waiting for them to simply turn his body over to the Brin so they can turn his body into gelatinous mold again, and then he'll be resurrected. But luckily they didn't do that, but Shin Hoti seems to think that the progenitor technology will be able to revive him, because part of that diary seems to indicate that their technology will be able to revive dead people as well. And so she tells everything to the Brin, because Michael had to call the Brin to help save Skrull's life, and so the Brin leader personally arrived with some medical equipment, and then Shin Hoti just tells him everything, that she knows how to find the progenitor tech and all of that, and Michael just stands there and looks at all of it. Why don't they beam her out immediately so that she will not be able to tell the Brin anything? They just allow her to keep talking and telling the Brin that the Federation is hiding their biggest secret from you, and I will help you get it if you take me with you and all of that. And then the Brin agrees not to attack the Federation if they allow them to take Shin Hoti, and then the Federation just agrees to let them have her, and then the Brin just leave. But they don't actually have any of the clues, and so there is no actual danger. But they did out of the blue say in this episode that the Brin can track their spore jumps. And so what are they planning to do next? To jump to the next clue. So why the hell would they do that if they now know the Brin can track their spore jumps? So why jump to the next clue? Why not, take a cloaked ship there? Take some other more sneaky way to get there, use some actual spies, recruit some people the Brin wouldn't know about, and have them take some other ships to that location. What's the hurry to try to find it? The Brin have none of the clues. So what's the hurry to jump to the next clue if you just said that the Brin can track your spore jumps? So obviously the Brin will just follow you there. So why go there on your ship? Why not do some more clandestine way of getting there and do it later when you're more prepared? And so nothing makes any sense if you actually think about it. And so they're now going to the Badlands from Deep Space Nine. It seems like this whole season someone has been reading up on Deep Space Nine and taking all kinds of cool ideas from there and making their own version. That's why we have the Brin, that's why we saw a wormhole, that's why we're going to see the Badlands, that's why there is a Ferengi bartender with a Morn type of alien in the bar always. And so they seem to try to mimic Deep Space Nine for some reason. So now they will be going to the Badlands while knowing that the Brin can follow them, and they'll go anyway. And then the Brin will be the final villain of this season. And what would be interesting if we have a cameo by that actress who played the female founder, who also played that progenitor we saw in the TNG episode The Chase. That might be cool to have another recording by her to reveal something interesting, I hope. And hopefully they will not do something stupid. And if they just destroy this technology in the end, then what was the point of this whole season? If they don't actually accomplish anything, that will be ridiculous. So I guess we'll wait and see. So this episode was really terrible, kind of boring. A lot of political talk, which could be interesting. Deep Space Nine did a lot of political episodes, but because it was written well, then that was interesting. But here it doesn't actually make any sense, and that makes it annoying. And we also saw that big alien head in the background, which is something I predicted when I first saw this new alien in the first episode of the season. I said this new alien will now be in the background of every episode, because whenever they invent some new alien masks, suddenly those types of aliens are everywhere in the background. And so the same is true with this new ridiculous looking alien who is always in the background now. So there's a lot of political talk, which again could be interesting if it was actually written well, but nothing makes any actual sense if we actually think about it. And so this whole episode felt really cheap and lazy and stupid, unfortunately. So that's my review. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.